moment. The thing is, I'm Jonne Soininen. I work for Nokia. My title is Head of Open Source Initiatives. My team runs the Open Source Program Office, but we are also coordinating the different open source activities in Nokia that are related to Nokia actually being engaged in, near the chin, being engaged in open source activities and open source projects outside. The previous presentations have been more talking about using open source software. My kind of weight on this is, or emphasis is more talking about how we are actually engaged in open source software. And but when I hope that during my presentation, what becomes clear is these are actually interlinked things, and rather than there was a beep. Interlinked things rather than something that are separate. I joined again Nokia, so I haven't dark passed in Nokia. I joined it for the first time for 1999, but I left Nokia in 2011 to do something else and joined back in 2014, since when I've been actually responsible for open source in Nokia. This is, however, not the first time that Nokia is doing open source. But let's look at first why we're doing open source. Open source has clearly, let's put it quite bluntly first. Our customers want us to use open source. Our customers want us to be involved in open source, and they say that out very clearly. And this is something that, because this is a way where we can actually work together in a different way than what we have worked in the past. Actually, we were talking on the break that telecommunication manufacturers have been in the forefront of open source, and that is actually quite natural, because in telecommunications, what we have learned over the years is working together. We have worked together a lot through standardization, different industry activities, and so on. When we created different standards on the for the phone system, and especially in the mobile phone system, which became global standards. So we were used to working together already. So open source is natural progression of that. But in open source is also the first time where actually it's not only just a cooperation on paper, but where our customers can also contribute themselves things that they think are necessary. And also, at least theoretically, even individual people can contribute, and we get innovation from outside that we wouldn't get otherwise. I have to say this is very much true, these individuals getting active in these things, in projects like Linux, but I have to say that this might not happen as often in some things quite esoteric, such as telecommunication network management systems that are not maybe the most sexiest things in the world. Why do we do open source? What are the benefits that we see? And these might seem actually things that everybody says about open source, but actually when everybody says that, some of that must really be true. We love the openness, so we have lower vendor lock-in. That is what our customers want, but this is also what we want from going downstream. The joint innovation, when we do things together, we learn from others. We get faster development. This is something that is always a little bit difficult, because people say, well, actually the development is not faster. And I have to say that is true. There is no faster development than when you alone write code. But, and you don't have to look for any kind of like consensus, is this good or not? But the thing is, what you don't get is the collaboration. That's just you writing something. You don't get anybody else's input. That doesn't really get better. And when something gets really big, like Linux or OpenStack or Kubernetes, it's just impossible to drive that just within one software team or within one company. It is the only way of doing that is actually together. Otherwise, you will grind to a halt and you will be really, really slow at moving forward. Security, this is also that people say, well, is open source really secure? Because I have this one package that I downloaded and that had a bug in it. Yes, you're right. You can find bad open source software as well, but generally, when you look at an open source software that has a vibrant community behind it, it really is more secure than just proprietary software. And the quality also is related to that, the same phenomenon. Whoops, wrong button. The interesting thing for us is basically that there is, if you want to be part of some open source software project, there are a lot to choose from. So you have to think carefully which are projects that you actually want to be involved in. And so that's what we try to look at these 4 things when we choose a direction, and we choose basically which projects we think are useful. Of course, the first thing is that it has to be useful for you. It needs to be an open source software that you want to be part of, you want to contribute to, and because you want to use it, because it's beneficial for you. That's, of course, table stakes. But then when you look at the project, you look at the certain kind of things that is it actually viable over long term? And that is what we looked at, these 4 things: industry alignment, timing, industry support, and project governance. Industry alignment is basically that you have to see that there is a common problem for the industry and for the open source community that they are trying to solve. If there isn't, you most probably, or there's confusion what their problem is, you most probably won't get good code and you won't get a good direction from the project, and the project is not moving along nicely. The second thing is timing. Is this the right time to solve this? Is this project's timing right? Is there another project that has been before it? That would be a better thing that you should put your time and effort in rather than starting a new one, for instance. This comes very often, especially when we talk to internally our people who are really interested to open source something that they've done. My first question is, who do you think that has done this before and why you are not joining them, rather than bringing something new into the community that will further fragment the community and put just another logo on the page before. Then the kind of like, there needs to be an industry support, which means that not only that this is a common problem that we share, but we are actually willing to invest into that. So are people willing to put actually pairs of hands and developers into these things? People often confuse this with, are you willing to pay $250,000 to be part of an Linux Foundation project, and or 50,000 or something like that? And that is always the small money, though that it is real money when you put it all together. But the thing is actually, are people willing to put developers behind this? Are they actually willing to put lines of code? Are they willing to work on this? Then the last but not least is the project governance. And this is actually also important on when we use software, is that, okay, what is this community about? Is this a community actually at all? So is this one company that is publishing software and you cannot actually affect it? Is it something that has some strange license that actually doesn't give you the rights of open source? Or if you contribute to that it's actually under governance of one single company or one single entity. And so being active in something, what we look at is the project governance really like that we can participate in a constructive level. And when these 4 things, of course with the fifth one that we're actually interested in this software, are together, then we look at it, then we think that these that kind of like open source project is viable. We don't necessarily, we like open source, we do a lot of open source, but that doesn't mean that we do open source on everything. We look at really then also that where we can really add value. We don't go to every single project that we think is viable, but we look at that where we can add value ourselves. And of course, something that would be software that we could use internally and that we have an interest in. We wouldn't go just to a project that we wouldn't use ourselves. But we also do proprietary software, that is quite clear, and I want to be clear about that. That is what we see as our differentiation, and we see that open source software really is at its best, where the participants in that project feel that that software is non-differentiating between them. That doesn't mean that there would not be somebody else in the industry that would find that, well, you are writing software that I have proprietary and that is differentiating. That's just fine, but at least the people that are in the project have to find that they have an interest to collaborate rather than keep things to themselves. Like I said earlier on, a standardization was in this telecom space before, so that's why we have actually this experience of working together in telecommunication, and that has not gone away. And there are every now and then there are discussions about, will open source kill standardization, or is open source needed? Is standardization actually the way how grown-ups do this, and should we all cut our hair and actually do something really nice in Etsy or ITU or so on? And I think that this discussion is actually not very helpful. Open source has clearly its place, and so has standardization. I don't think that open source will replace, quote unquote, replace standardization, or standardization is in any ways competing with open source. We have a lot of open source implements a lot of standards, reference to open source, and what we are in the world where these two things have to work together. And I think that this has happened and is ongoing already. We have a lot of examples of that basically we have even now groups where open source and specification or standardization making work very close together. So what does this mean to Nokia is that we select which openness organizations or which openness technologies we use actually in our products. We like to look at the world through what we call the Future X architecture, where we put the different elements or different domains of the telecom networking, and there we see that there are different layers where different technologies are important. And some of them are open source, and some of them are standard space. How do we do this? How do we use software, and how do we contribute to open source software? Basically, we started off. I think that Cedric gave this presentation in the morning, which put the 4 time zones of, or different kind of steps of evolution of open source, and we've gone through something similar internally. We mostly had proprietary-led software when we started in the late 70s doing network equipment. That was how everybody did it. We had our proprietary hardware, we had our proprietary software, and we were basically doing that all ourselves, even operating systems and so on. Then we started using open source as a component a little bit, kind of like a library there, a library here, an IP stack there, and putting it in. And we also started to use even bigger components like operating systems. We used FreeBSD very early on when Linux wasn't quite as adapt to that task yet. And what we did is what everybody does for their first open source software: take the software, modify it for your own benefit, and keep it internal. And then you think that I know how to use open source software. That doesn't work very well. That's one particular product where we had changed FreeBSD, which was for our differentiator in the beginning. After a little while, was not a positive differentiator anymore, and we had to rewrite the whole product. So what this has then come is to where we are today, is that what we try to do is when we use software, if we have to modify it, if we think it needs a feature, if we find a bug, if we want to modify it in any way, we upstream it back right away. This is not just, of course, like it was said in the morning, you have to give back, but this is not just giving back. It is beneficial for you yourself that you don't fork the open source software, because you will be in a world of pain with your forked software when the community has run away from you and is much ahead of you. I'll skip that and just come, because I think I'm running out of time very soon. 2 minutes left. Okay, excellent. Thank you. The thing is basically that we do have an open source program office like everybody else that does that, where we look at who owns the processes of using open source software, who will make sure that is responsible for the compliance of open source software, and that is for the usage side. So we basically make sure that all our products, before they get out of the door, before any release gets out of the door, that we have gone through our open source compliance. We understand which licenses are there, and we do comply to those licenses. In addition, what we do is that we look at the contribution also, what goes out from Nokia. This doesn't mean we don't have a central organization that contributes out from Nokia. What we really want to do is to do that what we had in the previous slide, which is the kind of like open source software is part of the normal R&D. So it has become a part of our normal R&D function. When you use open source software, you're expected to contribute if you change that. What we just do in the in our open source program office is basically make sure that we do that deliberately. We do that in a coordinated fashion, that there isn't not one group from Nokia 1 week and the next week somebody else is from Nokia is trying to delete those patches, which could happen if you don't coordinate it. Anyways, but the important thing is the open source contribution itself is part of our product R&D process. How do we see this moving forward is the working together in open source fashion is only going to be increased. This is not going to go away. This is not a hype that will go away. This will become a part of your normal development, and you should be ready for that. But what we will also continue is differentiating between vendors. We will continue to, in a friendly way, to compete with our friendly competitors, and that will not change. So, as I'm showed to the stop sign, this is my last slide, and Nokia is really embracing open source and really opening up innovation with it. Thank you.